Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Howdy folks, you're listening to the voice of Lucas White, editor at PrimaGames.com. I'm here taking over the Side Quest podcast to talk about Void Terrarium, a 2020 mystery dungeon style roguelike RPG smashed up against a Tamagotchi-style virtual pet. Somehow, this is a post-apocalyptic story about human survival and deadly mushroom, kind of like that other game that we won't talk about. In this game, which was developed by Nippon Ichi Software, directed by Masayuki Furuya, you take on the role of Robbie, an appropriately named robot who is brought back from malfunction as a rat climbs into his body and chews on something it probably shouldn't be chewing on. You can guess what happened after that. R.I.P. little buddy. Robbie wanders around his surroundings, looking for a job to do. He's a little service robot. But, by this point the apocalypse has already run its course. Humanity's gone. Mushrooms are everywhere. It's kind of pretty. Lots of differing shades of green, little floating particles. It's a pretty nice looking end of humanity, if I do say so myself. Robbie discovers a functioning computer system, a remnant of humanity's last-ditch efforts to survive. He also finds a little human girl named Toriko. She survived. Not for long, obviously. She already has mushrooms growing out of her face. She's in a little glass bottle with a breach in the side of it. Not much of a terrarium. Especially in the void. So Robbie and the computer decide amongst themselves to see what they can do about keeping this little girl alive. And that's where the action starts. You have to dive in to the former human stronghold deep underground, brave the various mushroomy creatures and hazards, find resources to try to keep this girl going, and maybe save humanity in the process. Now, when I say mystery dungeon-like, mystery dungeon is not necessarily a genre. That's actually the name of the series. You see things like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon and Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, Shiren the Wanderer. All those games come from Chunsoft, and they're part of a long, long line of games dating back to a Dragon Quest spinoff. These kinds of games that are similar but not quote-unquote official pop up every now and then, but not too often, so it's cool to see NIS kind of throwing them out there every now and then. You may have played Unlosing Ranger vs. Dark Death Evil Man for the PSP, or maybe you've played The Guided Fate Paradox for the PlayStation 3. Either way, it's kind of interesting to see a niche genre sort of being derived by an equally niche, if not more so, company. And yet we live in an era where all these games can be localized, and that's great. If you're unfamiliar, a mystery dungeon roguelike is basically a sort of mix between, let's go with Wizardry and The Legend of Zelda. It's an isometric perspective. You're going through a dungeon that's more or less 2D. All the room layouts are randomized, and it's turn-based. So every move you take gives everything else in the area a chance to move, even if you can't see them. These games are notoriously difficult, though not in the same way we've come to expect from, say, the Souls-like. What's interesting about mystery dungeon games is how they tend to bend their own rules. If you go back to Shiren the Wanderer, it's as straightforward as can be. You jump in the dungeon, you survive as long as you can. If you lose, you start over from scratch. Nowadays, especially when you've got IP like Pokemon, Final Fantasy involved, you fiddle around with things a little bit and make sure the kids have a better chance to get through. So you have sort of the roguelite elements. Maybe you have permanent stat gains. Maybe you have actual levels that stay with you even when you're booted out of the dungeon. Or maybe it's just easier, you know? Void Terrarium is not that. Void Terrarium will kick your ass, definitively. When you dive into a dungeon as Robbie, your level is reset, like a traditional mystery dungeon game. And the sort of random effects you can run into are super, super randomized. Like, we're talking, you can wind up in what we call a monster room on, like, the second floor. Just, you're run over, you don't even realize what's happening. However, this is where the virtual pet stuff comes in. You see, while you're in the dungeon, Toriko sort of keeps you updated on how she's feeling. She can get lonely. She can get sick. She can defecate in her terrarium. All the good mystery dungeon and, virtual pet combinations. Threat of death and unsanitary living situations. So when Robbie gets knocked out, finds his way back, he doesn't lose the items he picks up, which is pretty unique for the genre. However, there's a twist. The items get broken down into materials that can be turned into things like furniture for the terrarium, or upgrades. Maybe you can keep your food a little cleaner. Maybe you can make the air just a little more breathable, so Toriko's less likely to get sick while you're out in the dungeon. When you build things, they come with permanent upgrades. Maybe you give Toriko a stump to sit on, and that gives Robbie a little bonus to his HP. You start off back at level 1 when you jump in, but your stats are a little better. What makes it even more interesting is when you level up, you don't get stats. You get to choose from a set of, let's go with perks. Sometimes it's just like an attack boost. Sometimes it's something a little more abstract. Maybe you get a bonus to your attack based on how many enemies are in the room at any given moment. Maybe your attack range changes, or the arc of it significantly gets transformed. Sometimes it's weirder stuff. But what's interesting about this is not only are you basically kind of putting your build together as you level up, you can have a little bit of influence over your options there. You can choose a sort of class that alters the pool. You can be a warrior, and the options you get will be more tailored towards physical properties, for example. Not only can you expand the number of options, you can get opportunities to maybe reroll them, or remove options you don't want to ever deal with. So as you kind of get into the thick of things, you can really start guiding the path you're on in terms of how you power up your little robot friend. In the meantime, there's always that threat of Toriko's health hanging overhead. And you may be thinking this sounds kind of like one of those survival games where you're watching meters tick down. There's nothing you can do about it except for constantly running back and farming garbage just to keep the bare minimum of sustainability. That's not the case here. It's more of an affect than a mechanic. Obviously, if you neglect the little girl, she's going to be your one-way ticket to a game over screen, but generally speaking, Void Terrarium is aggressive at first, but it's really interested in seeing you succeed. Toriko will get sick, or she'll need something, and you may be forced to leave a dungeon early. But generally speaking, if you need something, it's going to show up wherever you are. And if it doesn't work out, you get enough time to try again a few times. It's almost like the hybrid genre gimmick is just a really effective framing device for the whole game. It colors the tone, it colors the stakes. It doesn't necessarily beat you over the head with them, but they're there. And the game wants you to pay attention to it, and the game wants you to care about it. This game doesn't necessarily want you to be afraid of it. And that's because Void Terrarium, despite its species-ending premise, is actually a pretty hopeful and optimistic game. It may not be hopeful about the future of humanity, but there's a sort of heart to it underneath everything. There are multiple story paths, which I hesitate to get into, but even as you approach your end-game era choices, you kind of start to notice that Robbie seems to care. He develops a bond with Toriko. I mean, I just referred to Robbie as a he just now. And that's kind of, I think, where this game pushes you. You know, big shocker, a Japanese game starring a robot has questions about existence. And it doesn't ask them as loudly as something like Ghost of the Shell or Nier Automata. It just sort of suggests that you believe a little robot totally brought back from nothing on circumstance. Again, R.I.P. Rep. Somehow you have to think about the relationship that's formed here. Does Robbie have more than just a programmatic interest in keeping Toriko alive? Who can say? It's up to you. To me, there's just a perfect storm of video game stuff going on. It's a story with a unique setting. It's a story that, despite being about a really brutal situation, isn't just about people being awful to each other, isn't nihilistic in the way that the genre usually is. And yet that doesn't mean it's happy-go-lucky either. It just sort of comes to the table with a different kind of perspective in a familiar space. And honestly, I'll stand for any mystery dungeon game. I mean, you tell me that there's mystery dungeon stuff happening, I'm there, day one. I don't care who's in it. Pokemon, sign me up. Etrian Odyssey, that's weird, but okay, yeah, let's go. I'm not even that into roguelikes, honestly, but there's just something about deceptive simplicity of the format here that just really, really pulls me in. And the games are so similar, but, plodding through a dungeon, some enemies show up. You never know what items you're going to get. You never know if you're going to accomplish anything before you get your ass kicked. But it's very low pressure at the same time. It's not like Dark Souls, where you just feel horrible the whole time you're playing. You can kind of get into a groove. You can relax, even during tense situations. It makes losing feel better. Granted, a game like Void Terrarium that has those permanent upgrades, that helps. But still, it's just something about the way these games are put together. It just feels good to play. Now, when you're into a video game, when a video game is special enough to do something like talk about it on a podcast for 20 minutes, it's not always just the game, it's sometimes the externals, right? The context, what was going on when you were playing this game. I review games. Obviously, I had Void Terrarium before it came out. But it just immediately took hold of my wife for some reason. She was watching me play and just was enthralled. And she enjoys video games, but she has health problems that prevent her from doing things like really investing time in something. But since I had it on the Switch, and we're a multi-Switch household, we would often just sit there and play together. Maybe that's not so hunky-dory with whatever embargo I was under at the time, but who cares, right? I was having just a nice, laid-back gaming experience with my life partner. That doesn't happen often. And, I'm not one of those people that are like, oh, I need a gamer girlfriend, but, it's nice to share something. And so this is a game that really just, has left a mark on me. Not just because it's a really interesting and adorable and thought-provoking little RPG, but because it impacted my life on the outside a little bit. And with that, I think it's time to wrap up. I hope that as you listen to me on this journey of revisiting a video game that came and went quicker than, I don't know, NFT discourse or something. Maybe you'll check it out for yourself. It's pretty cheap. Well, digitally. But give it a whirl. Maybe you haven't played a Mystery Dungeon before. Maybe you haven't. It's been a long time. Roguelikes are cool now, I mean, these games predate Souls stuff by decades. But we're past that now. Give it a shot. Or don't. I mean, I'm not going to be watching you or anything. Toriko might be a little sad. Anyway, thank you for listening to SideQuest. I have been Lucas White, PrimaGames.com, Hokuto no Lucas on Twitter, like Fist of the North Star, but me. Happy gaming, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Hey.
Oh, hey, Jeff.
What's going on, guys?
Oh, talking about Superman.
Oh, cool. I could talk about Superman.
I could talk some more about Superman.
We know.
I'll bet a few people would want to get in on this.
I'm down.
You know it.
That sounds like fun. I'll do it.
Cool, let's do it. We can call the show Men of Steel.
And you can find it at certainpov.com.
Or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yay.
CPOV.
certainpov.com.